here with the NGS, and I have experience in the survey realm, so I'm coming at you from the survey realm. Bottom line up front, bluff is a common term we use now. This is a slide from Drew Smith, who is our modernization manager, and I think it's a good slide. If you do any geospatial in the work in the U.S. and you utilize the National Spatial Reference System, every product you've ever made, survey, map, every point cloud, LiDAR point cloud, every image, every DEM will have outdated coordinates on it within the next year. And that is this year, 2025, we expect to move to production. There will be a 6-month delay between production and final modernization. And at that point, the NGS will cease using NAD83. Obviously, vendors such as Trimble and Esri will still have access to NAD83, but the NGS services will stop within NAD83 and move on to the new datum, which I'll talk about next. Here are the federal partners relying on the NSRS. I'm sure many of you work alongside these agencies, so there's a lot of users of the National Spatial Reference System. Modernizing our reference frames to align with the International Terrestrial Reference Frame. So NAD83 and NEV D88 were defined prior to the pre-GPS era. I look back on the original documentation, and there were no forms at all for any GPS data at the initiation of NAD83. So they got in just a little bit ahead of GPS, and we've been paying the price ever since. These datums were defined by unmonitored, unstable, and easily destroyed passive marks. They were defined without the aid of gravity mission satellites and airborne data. They were defined without any long-term strategy to address Earth's dynamics or any of the spatial velocities. And we, in turn, had to modify global models to fit this imperfect reference frame. The systematic errors you see there, about 2.2 meters horizontally and a half to 2 meters plus, depending on where you are in the US and the territories. The goal of the project is to increase efficiency, to get rid of this old datum that we've been struggling with and start fresh, as many international countries have already done. The main benefits: fast, accurate, consistent elevations everywhere, improve public safety, floodplain maps, and emergency route planning, accurate positioning, autonomous vehicles, building models, smart cities. I just found out yesterday that the city of Phoenix has auto taxis. So they have driverless taxis around the city of Phoenix right now. So this is all current. And we really do need this modernized NSRS. It increases efficiency. Like I said, we're going to have one vertical datum pole to equator. Consistent heights offshore, near shore, and onshore. That wasn't usually the case, especially in some of these remote territories, or as we all know in New Mexico, some of the remote areas in New Mexico have very limited leveling and thus very limited accuracy of orthometric heights. We're going to simplify procedures to accept geodetic data from the public. What we used to consider bluebooking is now done through Opus projects, through GPS and leveling. And it's a lot, it's going to be, it currently is, and it will continue to become a lot easier than in the past. We're going to simplify the data collection and reduce the risk of coordinate and position inconsistencies, especially along state and international boundaries. Improve the usability and accuracy of tools. I'll show you some of those tools from the NGS later. And consistency between ellipsoidal and orthometric heights. That, again, is particularly critical in New Mexico, Arizona, some of these remote areas that don't have the leveling that the eastern part of our country has. So the common theme here, again, efficiency will improve your workflows because there will be one system. So NAD83 is going to be replaced with 4 reference frames. There used to be 3. the Caribbean terrestrial reference frame is added. So hopefully you've heard some of these. NATRIF, CATRIF, PATRIF, and MATRIF are the 4 new reference frames with the new NSRS. And here is a map of those. You can see between the continental United States and the Pacific Plate includes a lot of California and those velocities there. Importantly, the epoch initially at epoch 2020.0, which is January 1st of 2020, ITRF will be identical to the NATRIF 2022. So that is the origin. Those two will be identical and somewhat diverge after that. I'll speak a little bit about that and our plate tectonics and station velocities. So here is improved knowledge of the Earth's center. These are the datums between the ITRF and the NAD83. You can see there's more than 2.2 meters difference between the origin. For all you OPUS users out there, you can see that those differences are shown between the ITRF and the NAD83 positions. Remember that we have GNSS techniques that allow us to measure to the size of a thumbnail, but yet our current datum is offset from the global datum where the satellites are, by 2.2 meters. And we've made it work, but perhaps at the detriment of regional and international efforts. We've always had to move our GPS data to NAD83. Importantly, I think it's important to state that there are 3 coordinate types. There's a global position, and that is the time of collection. And this is a reference to the GNSS constellation, and it is the position on the planet at the time of collection. Now, the local datum is NAD83, and it's currently NAD83 with the epoch 2010.0. The adjustment was done in 2011. It uses the core's positions on January 1st, 2010 to constrain all the passive control. The local datum is latitude, longitude, and ellipsoid heights critically. Again, about 2.2 meters from the global datum. And the datum is accessed by marks on the ground, by your data sheets, or a datum transformation is required to go from the ITRF system to the NAD83 system. The third coordinate type is a grid coordinate type, and this is the one that we're most familiar with, I would imagine. Northing, easting, and importantly, orthometric heights. Orthometric heights require a geoid model to determine the elevations from the geometric ellipsoid height. And for grid projection, a projection is required. The local datum does not have a projection, but the grid requires a projection. Let's see. Here is a map of the velocities of the core stations on the continental United States. All these arrows are about 2 centimeters long, so 2.5 centimeters per year is how these are moving. This picture can generally be interpreted at what velocity are points in the continental United States moving relative to the International Terrestrial Reference Frame, or I guess more importantly, how much plate rotation does NAD83 ignore? So the difference in direction is obvious. The plate is modeled for rotational movement until we reach California and the Pacific Plate, and you can see those velocities are quite a bit different. The Pacific Plate has its own velocity grid. So here is ITRF. This is the ITRF grid in 2020, and the ITRF 2020, excuse me, and the North American Terrestrial Reference Frame in 2022. At January 1st, 2020, these are identical. And to reduce one of the problems is people don't like changing coordinates. We would like to keep our coordinates as consistent as we can, as long as we can. So the strategy that we've come up with, or that the NGS has come up with, is to reduce the magnitude of the coordinate change. NATRF is fixed to the North American plate. Over time, ITRF and NATRF coordinates will diverge, but the NATRF coordinates will stay relatively consistent, reducing the complications to these coordinate changes. So you can see there's a point in Indiana here. As ITRF, as our time moves, the red is NATRF and the blue is ITRF, and our coordinates will stay consistent through time due to this plate rotation model of the in this case, the North American plate. So after that plate rotation is taken into account, these are the same velocities of those stations shown on the previous slide. And you can see now that they're all dots instead of arrows, except for in California. But even on a stable North American plate, these velocities are not zero. So this can be interpreted as at what velocity are points on the continental United States moving relative to the North American plate. And there will be a interframe velocity model that will contain these tiny deviations from simple plate rotation. So moving on from the geometric to the geophysical, this is how we get our elevations and help determine where water will flow. Previously, if you worked in different locations, you'd use different height systems. Now we'll have one vertical datum from the poles to the equator using the NAPGD 2022. That's the North American Pacific Geopotential Datum of 2022. Similar in the past, there were multiple orthometric height systems depending on where you worked, especially if you were in some of the outlying territories. Now we've got it consistent with one vertical datum, and thanks mostly to GravD, the gravity for the redefinition of the American vertical datum. That project is complete now, and those results are included in the NAPGD 2022 geopotential datum. Again, one vertical datum pulled to equator. That's a great improvement from NAVD 88. Here is the geopotential datum. It's at 4 centimeters absolute accuracy. There are places in mountainous regions and situations like Grand Canyon up in Alaska. Some of those stations are over 4 centimeters absolute accuracy and actually over 5 centimeters, but it's a great improvement from what we've had in the past. I know that in Arizona, between geoid 09, geoid 12, geoid 18, some of our orthometric heights changed by as much as 30 centimeters between those hybrid geoid models that were combining leveling data with limited gravity data. Now we have a large area that's defined with satellite, airborne, and terrestrial gravity observations, along with satellite altimetry. So the NAPGD 2022 models include the geopotential model, include geoid 2022, include deflection of the vertical and gravity. A lot of these are available on the Alpha site that I will speak to in a little bit. Primary access to the data will be through GNSS. We'll have a geoid model that encompasses the entire hemisphere relative the northern hemisphere here, and there will be consistency between, especially in remote areas of New Mexico and Arizona. There's going to be a lot more consistency with our orthometric heights. The horizontal shift and the vertical shift, this is kind of where the rubber meets the road. I hope some of you are familiar with this already. Between 1 to 1.5 meters on the North American plate, mostly due to that origin that we spoke of earlier. And then on the right is the vertical. going from over or above 0 meters to minus 1 meter in Washington and a little bit more in the Seattle area. Now we think about how the future coordinates will change, will differ, but this map also shows the biases that were within NAD83 and NAVD88, that we had to tweak global geoid models to make them fit our old datum. So I hope a lot of you have seen this map and you'll be seeing it more in the future. This is really going to come into play with change detection, which I heard mentioned earlier in the meeting. So recently completed activities related to the modernized NSRS. We're kind of rounding third coming to home on this one. They're a multi-year course solution that is a position of all the course stations on January 1st, 2020. And that comes from a least squares adjustment of the less number of IGS stations. There are course stations that are both part of NOAA cores, but are also part of the international community. Those IGS core stations are used, the IGS community determines station velocities for all those stations, and then NGS took those results from the international community and applied them through least squares to the thousands of NOAA cores that are available through Opus projects and so on. So that is complete, and we have new positions for all of our core stations on January 1st, 2020, and that will be the constraints for the new datum. Opus projects and advanced training are available. Opus projects has come a long way. If any of you have used it in the past, I think you will be impressed with not only the usability of it, but also the help. The F1 triggers your help menu, and that is tied directly into the Opus project. I think that is a great improvement. The Earth rotation parameters that I showed earlier with the velocity change at the core station, that is all done. The Euler pole parameters, they're called. The state plane coordinate system of 2022 is complete, near complete. Many of the states are voting on it now to put it into legislation. I have an example of that coming up for New Mexico. I can show if we have enough time. Geoid 22 and GravD are completed. So those are involved in the creation of the NAGPD 2022 geopotential datum. NGS 92 is a new document that states what is required for users to get the accuracy that they believe that they need. This is a great improvement over the NGS 52 and 53 documents that were the 2 and 5 centimeter documents that some of you might know. The NGS 92 is directly related to Opus projects and really simplifies for the user their survey proposals, their observation schemes, how much time they need to rely on the observations to get the accuracy that they require. And just recently, last year now, but in December of last year, a federal notice went out that gave a kind of weak timeline on where we are on this. We expect this to go to the 6-month testing period this year. So by June of 2026, we'll be completely into our NATRIF, PATRIF, MATRIF, and CATRIF datum frames. The state plane projections, there's been a lot of fretting on this issue because everyone's horizontal coordinates are going to change dramatically. Now, this is done so that there isn't confusion between NAD 27 and NAD 83. If you remember, there was confusion between those two, say in New Mexico, the east, central, and western zones. Those coordinates were not off by that much. Now the coordinates, the false northings and eastings are changed so that the new positions are at least 10 kilometers away from any previous datum, so that it will become simpler. We also have a single projection for each state for data holdings. I think this is particularly critical for this group. Since the statewide projection was designed for the actual topography of the state, its performance is comparable to the 1983 state plane coordinate system. So if you were using the central zone for all your work, the New Mexico Central Zone in NAD 83, I think you'll find that the new statewide zone will be comparable. You'll be able to use that just as if you use the central zone. It really is going to be helpful for the GIS community, because now there is one projection for every state that all of these spatial data archives can be associated to. Nearly 1,000 additional zones have been added between NAD 83 and State Plane 2022. These are all designed by and for the users. So many of the states, particularly Arizona and Utah, have quite a large number of zones because of the topography. New Mexico did not take that great of advantage of the possibility to add new zones, but there are low distortion projection zones for Las Cruces and for the Albuquerque area. The low distortion projections are used to minimize the difference in grid to ground distance and the associated scale factors when using total station measurements. So performance in these zones was targeted at 20 parts per million. That's 20 millimeters per kilometer, or only 1 centimeter difference between a ground distance and a grid distance for a 500 meter total station measurement. I know in Arizona, a lot of our NAD 83 state plane zones have the horizontal distortion of 250 ppm, and that's 25 centimeters per kilometer. So that's 12 centimeters for a typical 500 meter total station shot, and that is definitely noticeable in the accuracy of both GPS and total stations. Now, with the LDP, that 1 centimeter along a 500 meter shot is at the level that the instrument is able to perform, the accuracy of the instrument. Those are, I hope to get a little live thing. We can look at New Mexico here if there's time after the talk. Again, NGS 92, if you guys can get online and take this out, I can put it in the chat so you have direct access to it. This is a great document. It's taken a while to come out with, but it's really going to help surveyors give them ideas on exactly what is necessary for their job. Hopefully some of you have seen this. The best way is to redetermine coordinates in the modernized NSRS. The first and the most accurate is going to be resurvey, to get your equipment back out there on these marks that you use all the time, probably that are referenced for many of your spatial data projects, and get those things resurveyed in the new datum, tie them to the new cores positions, and so on. This is going to be the most expensive, but also the most accurate. Now, if your agency or organization has organized their data, has their network adjustments in a very usable form, or have the RINEX files, the antenna types, and the heights, then you'll be able to resubmit those files and you won't lose any accuracy. You can readjust it to the new datum. This is going to be quite a bunch cheaper than to go out and actually resurvey, but it's going to make sure that your agencies, it's going to require that your agencies are organized in their data and previous data collection from the NAD 83 datum. Finally, transformations. This will take the finished product, your rasters and so on. There'll be coordinate grids that transform between NAD83 and NATRF. But again, those are not going to be as accurate as if you go out there and resurvey or do a new adjustment to your old data. Embrace your vendors. They're going to help you through this. I can promise you that. Preparing for modernization. We have blueprint documents on the website, 1, 2, and 3. One is geometric, the GPS values. The second blueprint is geophysical and how we get our orthometric heights. And the third blueprint document is preparing for the future. So I would insist that you get to the NGS website and take a look at some of this and prepare yourselves and get people in your agencies to think about what's coming next. There's a lot of data available on our website and other websites. I know the ASPRS, the American Society for Photogrammetry and Remote Sensing, has re-upped their documentation for the NSRS modernization, and they've really grabbed the bull by the horns and moved forward quite dramatically. The primary on the NGS website, the primary products are on the alpha, preliminary products, are on the alpha site. They go to the alpha site first. People can view them, they can look for errors, they can see the parameters, and most importantly, this is the site that Esri, Trimble, Topcon, Carlson, all of our industry partners can go to the alpha website to find this information and incorporate that into their software so they know what's coming next. Again, these aren't the final answers, but it is the first step. It goes from alpha. Well, I'll just point out that the state plane coordinate system is on the alpha site currently. The geoid, the NCAT, which is our transformation tool, and the Euler point pull parameters are all on the alpha site now. After alpha, it goes to beta. When it gets to beta, it's almost done. This is where a lot of users will be grabbing the data and testing it from the beta site. There's a few items on there now. By the end of this year, all of our products will be on beta. And then 6 months after the switch has been flipped, it will be completely production is the final phase. So it goes from alpha to beta to production mode. Again, there's NGS resources available. There's a few here online. If Natalie can share this document with you, here are those websites. And if not, I'll make sure to send a separate link and put some links in there for everyone to view. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to NGS regional advisors. Again, I'm the advisor for New Mexico, but all of these people that I work with have a wide range of institutional knowledge, and we will really try to find out the answer for you. If you have questions, feel free to reach out. Together we can find the answers. And that's all I have for today for this discussion. I'm happy to move into a question and answer discussion. But before I do that, maybe I can go to the New Mexico Alpha site. And let's see if I can do this. If I go to the New Mexico site, which I have up here, and then share the screen again. Can you see that? Do people see New Mexico on the screen?
Yes. I see it. Yep.
Okay, great. So again, the boundaries for the eastern, western, and central zones for the 2022 state plane coordinate systems are similar to the NAD83, but you can see here that Albuquerque has its low distortion projection, and then there's also one down here in Las Cruces. The statewide zone layer can be shown on the same map. Again, we're going live here. And you'll see if you look at some of the maps online how the dark blue is high distortion and the red is minimal distortion, maximum distortion, and the best performance is along these green areas.
Call the tech support guys at Microsoft. They fixed all my audio problems. The audio was choppy and stuff.
Let's see. We'll go back to that Arizona, the New Mexico, and you can click on wrong. This is the one that has all of the coordinate systems for Arizona or for the 2022, and I'll show here in Bernalillo County. When you click onto this thing, you can anywhere on the map you can see that this is mostly green, which I pointed out before is the areas of low distortion. So you can use these existing alpha preliminary state plane coordinate system maps to see what the distortion will be for the map in your area. And again, just on a random spot that I clicked here is 18.5 parts per million. That's less than 2 millimeters per kilometer, the difference between the grid and the ground. Again, if you go back to the state plane zone and we go to the same area, the distortion here on the statewide zone is 420 ppm, which is 42 centimeters per kilometer. So there's no, death, taxes, and map distortion, right? There's no getting away from map distortion. If you have a large area, you're going to have areas with large map distortion. And that's why a lot of these communities have designed specifically for their areas these smaller zones that are often considered to be low distortion projections. There's also some, which I can send out. I don't have it up on my computer here, so I hate to jump into it cold, but there's also differences shown between the previous height systems, between geoid 12 and current, between geoid 18, well, I say current, between geoid 18 and the 2022 datum. There are good websites that work just like this in the ArcGIS experience that will show you how those perform as well, the differences that you can expect in height systems. And that's part of the real wake-up call with this modernization, is that we're changing our heights. It's really easy to notice if the heights are different by a meter or 2 meters, but it becomes a lot more complicated when the height changes are a half a foot, and that's kind of within our measurement ability. So it's really going to take the community to increase their knowledge, to communicate amongst yourselves, and really get your entire crew, your entire work group together so that you can discuss these changes that are coming very soon. And with that, I guess I will stop sharing and we can have a question and answer period.
Thank you so much, Keith. That was amazing. I'm so glad we've recorded it so that we can go back and watch. And I did put in the notes that I will forward this presentation and the YouTube video as soon as I get them.
Okay, and I can help by sending those text links, because you may just see the video of them and not necessarily the actual text.
That would be great.
There's a lot of information on NGS website. I encourage you to get out there and check it out. A lot of new information has come to light. Any questions regarding the new datum and modernization? Quiet.
I think we're all just like, oh my God, how do we organize our brains? Go, Rob.
Hey, I have a question, Rob Zer here at Bohannon, Houston. I know that I believe isn't Navajo Nation also a low distortion or quote low distortion projection covering New Mexico and Arizona? Can you comment about that?
Yeah, I can. That everything is done on a state by state basis. So each state decided how they were going to move forward with their coordinate system. Since the Navajo Nation is a combination of 3 states, they made a separate category for it. And I think the only things in that category, it's called a special use zone. I think the only projections that are in that special use zone is the Gulf of New Mexico or Gulf of Mexico, which has a number of states, and then the Navajo Nation, which has 3 states. So the boundaries and the parameters of the Navajo Nation low distortion projection are very similar, but they again have changed the false eastings or northings so that you will not, it will be difficult to confuse our current coordinates with the modernized coordinates.
Super. Thank you, Keith.
This is David Hatchner at the OSC. I guess I have a question. Maybe this is directed more towards Natalie, or that whether or not there's going to be an effort within the state to say that a coordinate or one of these new datums is what we officially should be using. Kind of a top-down approach of the state saying that everyone should be adopting these new coordinates. I think that would be helpful, at least in my opinion, instead of each individual agency. Because I can see some agencies, possibly mine, just being like, well, we've been doing it this way forever. Let's just stay with what we're doing until someone tells us we have to do otherwise.
Yeah, that is going to be a problem. And, like I said earlier, Trimble and these other industrial partners are still going to be able to access that NAD 83 datum, but there are reasons why we're moving to this datum, and just closing your eyes or putting your head in the sand isn't going to help. We really do need everyone to understand what's happening and to make the effort to move. Now, the legislation that's out officially is that 5 years after the switch has been flipped, all of these things have to be used, especially if money is being paid for it through any federal agency whatsoever. But I think we'll find within the first year that most people are migrating to this because it just makes more sense. It's going to make the GPS data easier to move into the datum. It's going to align satellite data and aerial data exactly, and we're not going to have to transform our NAD 83 forward into the new datum. The people that I think will struggle some of the most are the people that are doing change detection over the years. You have a data set from NAVD 88. 5 or 10 years later, you'll have a data set from NATRF 2022. And the users are going to have to understand what the difference is. And quite frankly, some of the spatial data integrity of those old data sets will be limited if we don't make the correct movements to resurvey, readjust, or at the minimum transform using these velocity grids.
Yeah, I think this is David, this is I mean, right, I'm like thinking, okay, do we need a does my office, if it actually gets created, right, do an RFP for on behalf of all the state agencies, right, to have somebody come in, analyze what everybody's using, what the business demands, the critical business demands that that need it to happen sooner or later, and put together a timeline and be like, this is what it's going to take. These agencies need to have this kind of money, this kind of resources to get this migration done and figure out how we can, if there's any stepwise motion there in terms of like do the things that we need the most, immediately, and coordinate schedules, right? If this organization does it, then these three must do it because they'll be talking different languages.
Right, and I think you'll have to push and lobby the FGDC, the Federal Geodetic Data Committee, and subcommittees for their assistance. The FGDC has members from all of these federal agencies on board, and they're the ones that are tasked with really pushing this down the chain of command. So if you have questions or concerns, find out who your FGDC committee members are and bring them up to them, especially in the geospatial community where I'm sure there's many questions. One thing I would add is that we have all these state plane zones. Somebody had mentioned before, which state plane zone do we use? If you're doing a pipeline or some longitudinal a roadway, obviously you want to use that projection for your area so that your grid distances and your distances along your highway, your river thread, your pipeline aren't accumulating or becoming less than real life. But one thing I'd like to point out is there isn't data lost if you're taking it from your low distortion projection and reprojecting it to the statewide zone so that everyone knows where your data is and how easy it is to find. There's no data lost between those reprojection. So you can pull the data set from the statewide zone and then reproject it into the local low distortion projection and get all of that information. The statewide zone is really going to help the spatial data community, in my opinion.
Rob, go ahead.
Keith, we're getting ready to head into our legislative session. And obviously, the surveying profession is a regulated profession. And in fact, the legislatures around the country often prescribe survey minimum standards, for example, and these types of, what is your recommendation for how we might work with our state legislatures? Maybe what are some examples that you may be aware of in other states in the jurisdiction? How are they approaching this with their state legislatures, and what advice would you give us for bringing our state legislators up to speed on this topic?
I think it's been handled a few different ways. Some of the states just simply add text documentation that says we will use the most modernized, the most up-to-date system that is available. Others have gone in and specifically denoted parameters for their coordinate systems and that sort of stuff. But luckily, there are a number of states that have moved on and have voted on this. So if you're into that legislation, if you have concerns about that, we can reach out to some of these states. If you ask me, I can get with some of the other advisors and find out the documentation that those states that have already passed this legislation have used, and you can use a lot of their same terminology and text verbatim in a lot of cases. But again, it varies for every state, and I think that if I were to give advice, it seems to be the simplest just to bring in that we will use the modernized NSRS and just put a few words in there that you're going to use the systems the most updated systems that are available today. And then if, for instance, if New Mexico decides to add other low distortion projections for some of these other communities, those coordinate systems will come in later after the NATRF is launched. And you won't have to go back into your legislation and say, "Oh, look, there's another low distortion projection that we used and that we created for Roswell," or something like that.
And I think Barry Phillips had given us some updates on how they were planning to update our legislation here to be the more generic
Oh, good.
Right.
Okay.
Unfortunately, he's traveling today, so he's missing this, but
Okay.
we'll definitely get him to do a follow-up after he watches this video.
Okay.
Great.
Okay.
Thanks, Keith.
Sure. Thank you. Any other questions from the group?
Do you, it's funny because I'm still thinking, right? Like who is going to sit down and read all this documentation? Like there's definitely agencies who will be more motivated, who already have certain, staff on hand that will need to be experts in this. How do you have opinions about the role of like the state surveyor in being expert in that versus like our, some of our GIS professionals?
Yeah, I think that what we're gonna see happen is that the contracts are gonna come out saying that you need to use the new datum. And that's gonna trigger the avalanche of concerns behind it. Somebody's gonna get a new LiDAR data set that's from the new datum, and they're gonna wanna see where the old road was compared to the new road and so on. And so that, the contracting is where it's all really gonna start. And then people are, especially if they're unprepared for these changes or their staff isn't knowledgeable about the changes and why they're being made, it's gonna put them in a detrimental situation. And to be honest, I think that if these a lot of these smaller companies, if they don't adapt these new policies, I'm afraid a lot of them are going to be bought out for less value, to be honest. This is the future, and we can't ignore it. We really need our staffs to understand all of what's happening and not just what's happening for their specific project.
Yeah, we definitely need to, put this in all of our new scopes of work. Any work that you guys are contemplating, planning budgets for. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a good point. Some of these highway projects are, take 5, 8, 10 years. Those are really going to struggle because they're going to start out in one, and then by the time they're at the end, they're not going to have the availability of the tools that they had at the beginning. So those, those projects are going to have to put in some extra work. Those and the change detection. I think those are two areas that really deserve some more attention.
I mean, I'm thinking in terms of like the legislature and cabinet secretaries, and what is the sort of subcommittee within the GAC that really would sort of spearhead the messaging on this. And, I can certainly bring this up to the DeWitt cabinet secretary, right? And actually like try and elevate this, right? Like the governor needs to be thinking about this. All the executive level agencies need to be, New Mexico counties. I think, how do you guys see this fitting into sort of the GIS affiliates advocacy and the timeline, and what are the local drivers? If the surveying community does it, then a lot of the local data is going to get updated. I mean, it's
right.
It's by the nature of it. Yeah.
I've kind of poked around in this, especially in some federal agencies. If we're going to get this information out to, the Department of Interior, they have the Bureau, the Park Service, the USGS, all of these different agencies. How do we get the information without going to each one of those individually? And I think the answer is quite often that chief information officer.
That's right.
That's a title that a lot of states use, that some agencies have a somewhat different name, but that chief information officer, it's his job to move this along. So if I were to suggest one person to start with, I would think that that would be a good search to find out who that chief information officer is for your agency or for the agency that you hope to be working for or you have a contract with, and discuss this with them and make sure that they know what's happening. You know, it's not clear to me if the chief information officer is more interested in how people use Zoom or Teams and not necessarily the, you know, new terrestrial reference frame. But I think that would be a great place to start, is to put it on their radar and make it their responsibility to pass that information along. So you're not nickel and diming yourself going to each and every agency that you work with.
Yeah, and there in New Mexico, there is something called the CIO Plus Forum, and I generally try and get on the agenda once or twice a year, and so I'll definitely find out, you know, when the next one is, see what your schedule is, you know, see if we can sort of get you know, a couple of agencies to take the lead on the messaging here.
Yeah, and the NGS they have a big effort that's rolling out January 23rd and into February, where they're approaching these federal agencies. So the NGS has a plan, a strategy to get out and get this word out to a lot of these federal agencies that you know, we all know that some of them don't jump on board real quickly. So the NGS is involved in that within the next month or month and a half. Hopefully they will then in turn take the bull by the horns and start communicating with the states. And you know, the states are responsible for the state data holdings. So that's a big part of the problem is, you know, now you have all of these data sets that are in coordinate systems that aren't always very well defined, you know, and even I didn't mention the U.S. survey foot. Somebody brought it up earlier this week, but the U.S. survey foot will not be used in the future datum, but is still part of NAT 83. It'll still be an archived issue. Arizona is supposed to be an international foot state, but a lot of communities still use the U.S. survey foot. And, you know, it's not always documented in these spatial data archives. So it will be simpler in the future with just a single definition of the foot, but we can't forget about the history and the fact that, you know, Maricopa County, which is one of the largest counties in the country, they still use the U.S. survey foot, even though Arizona is an international foot state. So, yeah, it's going to take an educated workforce to move through this.
Oh, it makes my head want to explode.
Well, improvements are coming. It will become easier. I really believe that the coordinate system, the amount of work that's been put into this state plane coordinate system is really going to help in the future. It's not a detriment. It's not something to hide from. It's something that will help our community.
Larry Bratman, are you here? Where is TRD in terms of like, it seems pretty important that some of our big, you know, boundary people, state lands, TRD, really get behind and advocate for this. Yeah. Okay. Software makers have the new spatial reference systems.
Yeah, they do have the parameters for the, and this is the alpha site. You know, Trimble has been working. There has been outreach between the federal agencies and these industrial partners, which I think is the term they like to use more than vendors. But they have this information. Of course, it's not current because we are not in the modernized NSRS yet. We're still using NAT83 and NAVD88 as our official datums. But once that switch is flipped, you're not going to be able to say send your data into Opus and ask for your New Mexico Central Zone NAT83 coordinates for that. That's not going to be available. Now, that doesn't mean that you can't transform the values from one datum to the other, or that these industrial partners are, they may still provide access to these other datums. But as far as the NGS and Opus projects and publishing control, they really want the word out that, you know, there is going to be a day when NAT83 ceases to exist for future data collections, and we are all on 2022 and the 2022 terrestrial reference frame. And it's been well thought out. I really believe that the way that they've handled the rotational boundaries so that our coordinates stay relatively consistent over the years, that's a great idea. We're not, you know, if you have an ITRF coordinate in California, it's changing by 10 or 12 centimeters a year, right? If you have a ITRF coordinate in New Mexico, it's changing by 2.5 centimeters a year. After 10 centimeters, that's 25. After 10 years, that's 25 centimeters. I mean, that's very noticeable. And the strategy behind the Euler pole parameters and the rotation of the reference frame is going to minimize those coordinate changes. And that's going to be beneficial. Instead of ignoring plate tectonics, we're dealing with it mathematically and simplifying it for the user.
Okay, so 5 years is the drop dead. 1 year is the expected, because you're starting to release into beta now. You got 6-month testing cycle on that. So by the end of the year, we should have clean production data.
I would say that by the end of the year, we'll be beginning our 6-month window, our 6-month testing window. So I would imagine
beta.
Production. Yeah. There will be, once everything goes to beta, the NGS will decide today's the day. 6 months from today, we have to test everything that is in the beta system all at once. And then 6 months from that day, it will be official, and the switch will be flipped, and you won't be able to get these NAT83 coordinates anymore. So, the latest, the Federal Register, I hope that it had a little bit more information, but it brings up that 6-month window. And, we anticipate near the end of 2025, we will begin that 6-month window.
For beta.
For testing in the beta and then into production. It's kind of confusing because some items are going to be in beta before that moment. And
but you'll begin the full pack. Yeah, I mean, you can't test. You can test the pieces, but until you get it all there, you can't do.
So all the pieces will be in the group together, and from that moment there'll be 6 months where I'm not sure how the strategy is going to encourage people to be testing it, but that's when the errors are really going to be found, and it's going to take communication between everyone to make sure we clarify those errors before the 6 month is up, because then it goes production and we're not going back.
This is Denise Price from the Laguna. I have a question.
Yeah, Denise, where did you say you were from?
Laguna.
Okay.
One of here. So when you say the NAT83 coordinates, you won't be able to get them. Is that just for Opus?
Yeah, well, all of the tools in the NGS will cease to work. I mean, I would imagine they're going to be archived for a certain while, but all of the tools that are existent, the flexion of the vertical, um, all of those models will be won't be live. Let's just say that it's not real clear how the NGS. I mean, they're not just going to delete all that work. They're going to have it stored in some archive database, but it's not clear how available that's going to be to the general public. And at some point, they're just going to shut it down. They just can't afford to keep two systems running, especially when one is going to be such a market improvement over the previous.
Well, maybe you can answer this question for me, because I deal with stuff like this working from a tribal perspective. We have right-of-ways for the railroad surveys that were done way back in the late 1800s, coming forward the 1950s, 60s, and we go back out, observe those points, and then bring that data back in, and then redraw the right-of-way from whatever is on the plat or legal description. But we have those coordinates in-house. So if we have to go back, and I have recently had to go back to the 1920s and look at the older datum, 22, I think. But I guess the question is, will I still be able to do that? And then you have to bring it from the later datum into what we're using now, which is NAD 83, just to make those comparisons of where things overlap, if they're far enough apart or close enough. But then now we're throwing in 2022, and I'm going to have to try to figure out, okay, how close are these two line work or right-of-ways?
Right. No, that's a great example, and the answer to that is NCAT. The NCAT system, the transformation between coordinate systems, will be available and will include those previous datums, but we can't promise that those transformation grids are going to be as accurate as you readjusting or resurveying that data. But you will have access to through NCAT, you'll be able to transform and reproject those older archive datums, that data into the new datum. That will be available. But to determine how accurately that is, that's going to be up to the user.
Keith, could you show that slide that has those sort of three levels? There was like resurvey, and then when you say the NCAT, are you talking about the middle tier, right? So if I've got my GPS, what are those files called? The
Rhinex files?
Yeah, the Rhinex, like the raw data files. I should be able to. That's not as far as the third less accurate, which is just transforming the output, right? Like she's a little better off because she's got all her raw GPS data, right?
Yeah, she can. So you'll be able to submit Rhinex files into Opus from well before the change of the datum. Yeah, and that's one of our points is that if you have your data well organized, if you know the antenna types, if you know the heights, if you have your Rhinex files edited and stored wisely, it's going to be a lot easier and a lot cheaper for you to make this leap. And if you don't, you're going to have to go to that next phase of the transformation grids, and you're going to be relying on those models that take into account, maybe one of the communities had a erroneous survey, so it's not a smooth transition between. It's not a smooth contour line, if you would, between the coordinates from the old datum and the new datum because an error was found. Those errors are going to be in the transformation grids, and we're not really going to be able to isolate that. But if you have the data, or if you go out there and resurvey those monuments, then you won't have to worry about the transformation grid accuracy in your area.
So So I think we probably have a lot of folks who have a bunch of GPS data, right, that they could go back to. I'm sure there's a reference document in that library that you have that talks about, here's all the minimum, here's the metadata you need about those data collection episodes, right? Like the height, you mentioned the height of the, is that of the receiver and all that?
Yeah, the antenna reference point,
Yep.
and that's, I would direct you to the blueprint document number 3, which is preparing for modernization. In there, there's case studies, and I think the case study thing is going to improve this year. It's hard to get people to contribute case studies if they haven't had to go through the process yet.
Right.
But there are a few case studies in there already, and we're going to encourage users to share their information, not just with the NGS and these blueprint type case study documents, but also amongst agencies and within groups such as this one. Share our information.
That's a good point, right? Like if you're doing any contracts for anybody, right? Even if you're not actually migrating, you could have them while they're familiar with your thing, like draft up the use case and propose sort of, this is what you would do with the data that we're building for you now, when the change happens. Yeah,
exactly. I think a lot of people are going to be going through the same complications, and this communication amongst these types of groups and these case studies can be very helpful for everyone. And I think there's going to be a push with this federal outreach to encourage this. Again, ASPRS, the American Society for Photogrammetry and Remote Sensing, they have a new document out that really improves some of their previous standards. They've made their collection in, they've written the document for themselves, and they've made things kind of simpler for themselves, which makes sense, obviously, if you're making the document. But they also have case studies, and they're going to be encouraging other people to contribute to their case studies. And I think that's particularly useful for the geographic information community.
Wow.
Changes are afoot.
Finally. I mean, I'm so glad, right? Because I feel like I personally, right, was getting numb, because it was sort of like, well, we sort of kept having every year or two, we'd have a presentation. And it was like, well, we got to go back to the drawing board. And I was like, when this hits the fan, like, we're all going to be like, oh my God, we kept hearing about it, and now it's finally here, right? I feel like we're finally here, and I almost can feel it in your voice. It's like we have all these things published, right? Like you guys are finally like lining up.
Yeah, and a lot of these things, the next step required the previous step to be completed. So that slowed things up. Obviously, the COVID really had an effect on this process, but now they're really starting to line up, and people have the data that they need to follow the next step. So the dominoes are starting to fall, I guess you could say.
Yeah, it's an amazing thing. We're all going to live through it and then retire. I mean,
well, I appreciate the chance to talk about this today. And if you have any questions at all, please feel free to reach out, and I'll do my best to find good answers for you all.
Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.